You know, usually when we think about a massive political revolution, we expect something, well, cinematic. We expect incredible scale.
Right, like a Hollywood blockbuster.
Exactly. You picture the marching armies, the sweeping speeches in the town square, the banners waving in the wind, the dramatic overthrow of a capital city.
Yeah, we want historians to be able to point to one explosive moment and say, there,
Yeah.
that is the exact second the world changed.
Right, because that's how we're conditioned to view history. We want it to be monumental and binary. One day a society is a tribal confederation, and, the very next day they are an iron-fisted empire.
We look for those bold, unmistakable strokes of transition. But then you step into the ancient world of the Israelites.
Oh, man, yeah. You open up the foundational text of the Old Testament, specifically the book we're looking at today, and suddenly that wide-angle Michael Bay-style camera lens just snaps shut.
It really does.
We find ourselves looking at a historical landscape that shifts its entire tectonic foundation, moving an entire nation from one era to another, not with a marching army, but with something incredibly quiet, almost invisible.
It is the absolute definition of subverted expectations. We are looking at the dawn of an institutionalized monarchy, the birth of a royal lineage that will shape the rest of global history. And it begins with the whispered, desperate prayer of a single, marginalized individual in a dusty temple.
It's amazing. Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to meticulously unpack a truly foundational era in human history. And I have to say, the source material we've brought into the studio today is fascinating.
It's incredibly rich.
We are looking through a stack of scholarly study guides and survey notes that are actually designed for a graduate-level theology course. Think first-year MDiv students.
Right, which is essentially a Master of Divinity. It's the degree people get when they are training to be pastors or theologians. And these resources are also meant for serious lay leaders in the church.
Exactly. These notes focus intensely on the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel, and they eventually take us all the way to the 8th century prophet Isaiah.
And we should mention, we are not just skimming an English translation here.
No, definitely not.
The sources we are utilizing are grounded in the primary texts. They draw heavily from the original Hebrew, specifically utilizing the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia.
And for those listening who might not know, what is that exactly?
Right. It's basically the standard scholarly edition of the Hebrew Bible. The goal of these notes is to really dig into the linguistic roots, the ancient Near Eastern historical context, and the rigorous theological analysis of the text.
Now, before we really get moving, I want to set the table regarding these sources, because when you're reading academic notes, you always have to know the framework the authors are using.
That's crucial, yeah.
These specific materials are written from what is called a conservative evangelical scholarly perspective. For you listening who might not be familiar with that term, it basically means the scholars writing these notes approach the text with a few core assumptions.
Right. They affirm the essential historical reliability of the events, for one.
Yes. And they argue for the unity of prophetic authorship, and they read the Old Testament as one unified redemptive narrative that ultimately points forward to fulfillment in Jesus Christ.
Which is a very specific, defined lens.
Exactly. Now, my job today and our goal for this deep dive isn't to debate that theology or ask you to adopt those political or religious assumptions.
Right. We aren't taking sides.
Not at all. Our mission is simply to act as your impartial guides, stepping inside that specific framework to see exactly how these scholars piece this ancient puzzle together. We want to understand their arguments, explore their textual defenses, and, well, unpack the really fascinating literary architecture contained within this material.
That is a very important distinction. We are putting on the glasses of the scholars who framed these notes. We're evaluating the text from within their paradigm. It allows us to see how beautifully and intricately this historical tapestry is woven together according to their analysis.
And the tapestry is wild. I mean, this isn't just a dusty genealogy. It is a dramatic, high-stakes transition from a decentralized tribal society to a centralized monarchy.
It has everything.
It really does. We are talking about a narrative packed with giant slayers, deeply corrupt priests, intense ancient Near Eastern culture wars, and the ultimate catastrophic failure of human-centric kingship.
It reads like a political thriller.
So let's build the world for the listener.
Yeah.
Where exactly are we in history when page 1 of 1 Samuel opens? Paint that picture for us.
Well, if we want to understand the Sitzenleben, which is a German academic term these sources use, meaning the setting in life or the social and historical context, we really need to place ourselves roughly between the years 1100 and 1010 BC.
Okay, so a little over 3,000 years ago.
Exactly. And this is effectively the Dark Ages for the Israelites. If you read the preceding era, the Book of Judges, the refrain that just haunts that entire text is, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes."
Which is an ancient way of saying it was total moral and societal anarchy.
Total freefall. I mean, they are existing as what historians call a decentralized tribal amphictyony.
Okay, pause. Amphictyony. Break that down for someone who isn't a first-year theology student.
Sure, yeah. An amphictyony is basically a loose confederation of tribes or city-states that are bound together not by a federal government but by a central religious shrine.
So no central king or president?
Right. In this case, the 12 tribes of Israel are held together only by their shared worship at the tabernacle, which is currently located in a city called Shiloh.
So it's almost like the early American colonies operating under the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution.
That's a really good way to think about it.
There's no standing federal army, no centralized tax system, no singular executive leader, just a bunch of independent states trying to survive.
That is a perfect analogy. And just like those early colonies, they are incredibly vulnerable. They are facing immense existential pressure from a group called the Philistines.
Ah, the famous Philistines.
Yes. The sources detail that the Philistines were part of a broader migration of sea peoples who had originated from the Aegean region, likely around modern-day Greece or Crete.
So they came across the water.
Yeah. Their civilization collapsed, they migrated across the Mediterranean, and they settled on the southern coastal plain of Canaan. And they established 5 major capital cities known as the Pentapolis. That's Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza.
And they brought some serious military upgrades with them, right?
They absolutely did. Crucially, the Philistines held an absolute monopoly on early Iron Age technology. The Israelites are basically a highland farming community fighting with bronze tools.
Which are softer and break a lot easier.
Exactly. The Philistines have advanced, hardened iron weaponry, iron-fitted chariots, and a highly organized military structure.
So politically, militarily, and spiritually, Israel is on the brink of extinction. Now, before we look at the narrative itself, who actually wrote this record? I know ancient texts can be tricky when it comes to authorship.
They can be, yeah. The scholarly consensus within our conservative sources notes that the book is technically anonymous.
So there's no, by the way, I wrote this at the end.
Right, there's no signature. However, internal evidence and external Jewish tradition, specifically a section of the Talmud called Tractate Baba Bathra 14b, attributes the primary compilation of the core historical accounts to the prophet Samuel himself.
Oh.
And the tradition holds that after Samuel's death, later in the narrative, 2 other prophets, Nathan and Gad, finished the records.
Which tracks, because I recall reading a cross-reference in 1 Chronicles 29 that explicitly mentions the historical records of Samuel the seer, Nathan the prophet, and Gad the seer.
Right, exactly. Now, our sources do acknowledge that the final canonical redaction, basically the process of editing and compiling these various prophetic records into the polished final form we have today, likely happened a bit later.
How much later are we talking?
Probably during the early divided monarchy, perhaps the late 10th century BC. But the key argument these conservative scholars make is that the core source material is early and reliable.
So it's not made up hundreds of years later.
No, they argue it reflects the actual contemporary, on-the-ground debate regarding the transition to a monarchy. They firmly push back against more critical, skeptical scholars who argued the entire book was a fictional polemic fabricated centuries later during the Babylonian exile.
Okay, so the stage is set. We have an epic political thriller. An iron-wielding, invading Philistine army is pressing in on a decentralized, vulnerable Israelite confederation.
It's incredibly tense.
Right. And if I'm directing this movie, I'm starting with a massive, chaotic battle scene. I want chariots, I want fire. But the author of this text does something totally counterintuitive.
They really do.
The book opens with the highly personal, quiet, almost hidden story of a barren woman named Hannah. That feels, I don't know, jarring.
It does feel out of place at first glance.
It feels like starting a sweeping documentary about the entirety of World War II, but the first 20 minutes are just focused on the daily struggles of a single mother in a small, remote town in Ohio. It feels completely disproportionate to the geopolitical stakes. Why start there?
It's a brilliant question, and the sources emphasize that this is a highly deliberate, sophisticated rhetorical strategy. By starting with Hannah, The author is introducing the core theological framework for the entire book and really the entire concept of the Israelite monarchy.
And what is that framework?
That theme is the reversal of fortune.
Reversal of fortune, the idea of Yahweh lifting up the poor and deposing the mighty.
Yes, exactly. Look at Hannah's situation. She is barren in an ancient culture where a woman's worth and social security were almost entirely tied to her ability to produce male heirs.
So she has zero social standing.
None. She is constantly mocked and provoked by her husband's other wife, Peninnah, who has many children. Hannah is weeping in the temple at Shiloh, utterly powerless, culturally marginalized, and deeply depressed.
She's just totally broken.
But then she prays. She makes a vow to God, and Yahweh, the sovereign God of the universe, remembers her. He opens her womb, and she gives birth to Samuel, the very prophet who will eventually anoint the kings and transition the entire nation.
Yeah.
Yeah, the author is sending a massive flare up into the sky for the reader. Pay attention. This is how Yahweh operates. He doesn't need the loud, the proud, or the powerful. He brings life out of dead wombs, and he will bring a faithful king out of a dead, chaotic nation.
And Hannah's response to this isn't just to quietly go home and raise her son. She brings him back to the temple to dedicate him to service, and she breaks out into this incredible theological poem in 1 Samuel chapter 2.
Hannah's song.
Right. Our sources spend a lot of time diving into the literary analysis of Hannah's song. It's not just a nice little hymn of gratitude. It is a structural masterpiece.
It truly is a masterpiece of Hebrew poetry. The notes highlight that Hannah's song is built on a sophisticated literary device called a chiasm.
Break that down for us. What is a chiasm?
So a chiasm is an inverted, mirror-like poetic structure. Imagine a sequence of ideas that goes A, B, C, and then mirrors back to C, B, A.
Like a literal mirror image.
Exactly. The center of the chiasm, the focal point, is the main theological argument. The poetry points inward, and the center of Hannah's song is exactly this reversal of fortune.
What are the actual words she uses?
She sings, "The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger."
She continues later, "The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn." It is an absolute systematic flipping of the societal hierarchy.
Completely.
The people on top are brought low, and the people on the bottom are exalted.
The sources argue that this song functions as the canonical thesis statement for the entire books of 1 and 2 Samuel.
The thesis statement for the whole era.
Yes. Everything that happens over the next several decades, the fall of the mighty entrenched house of the priest Eli, the rise of the humble boy Samuel, then the fall of the towering, prideful King Saul, and the rise of the overlooked shepherd boy David, all of it is just the historical outworking of the theology Hannah lays out in this poem.
And there's a fascinating intertextual connection here, too. This song doesn't just look forward to David, it looks backward to the Exodus.
Oh, the Exodus connection is vital.
Right. The notes show how the language and the theological structures of Hannah's song directly echo the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. That's what the Israelites sang right after God drowned Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea.
By repurposing the vocabulary of a massive corporate song of national deliverance, where God destroys the greatest superpower on earth, into an individual expression of a mother's praise, the author is making a profound theological point.
What's the point they're making?
That God's active delivering power in the life of a single, weeping, marginalized woman is structurally and theologically identical to his power in delivering an entire enslaved nation. He is just as engaged in the quiet corners of Shiloh as he is in the crashing waves of the Red Sea.
That gives me chills, and the theological echoes don't stop in the Old Testament. The sources point out that looking forward, Hannah's song becomes the exact literary blueprint for Mary's Magnificat in the New Testament Gospel of Luke.
It's amazing how that connects.
Yeah, when Mary, a poor teenage girl from Nazareth, finds out she is carrying Jesus, the Messiah, she sings, "He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate." Mary is essentially singing Hannah's song.
Yes, and the conservative framework views this as proof that this redemptive trajectory, God using the weak to shame the strong, culminates perfectly in Jesus Christ.
It is a stunning piece of canonical integration, but the text doesn't let us sit in that beautiful poetry for long, does it?
No, it abruptly shifts.
Right. The author immediately contrasts Hannah's faithful, quiet piety with the loud institutional decay of the current religious establishment. While Hannah is dedicating her son to the Lord, we are introduced to the leadership at the tabernacle, the aging high priest Eli and his 2 wicked sons, Hophni and Phinehas.
And these guys are an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, the text explicitly calls them worthless men who did not know the Lord. The sources dive into the mechanics of their corruption, pointing out that they are explicitly violating the Levitical sacrificial codes outlined in Leviticus chapters 3 and 7.
They're pretty brazen what they're doing.
Let's unpack what they were actually doing because it helps explain the severity of God's judgment later. When an Israelite brought a peace offering, the fat of the animal was supposed to be burned on the altar as the Lord's portion. It belonged entirely to God.
Right.
Then the priest was allowed a specific boiled portion. But Hophni and Phinehas were sending their servants with three-pronged forks to forcefully take raw meat, fat included, before it was offered to God. They are stealing God's portion to feed their own luxury.
It's institutionalized theft from the divine. And it gets worse.
Hard to imagine it getting worse.
Well, the text notes they were also sleeping with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. They were turning the holy sanctuary of Yahweh into something resembling a pagan fertility cult. It is total spiritual bankruptcy at the absolute highest level of leadership.
This sets up a terrifying dynamic. What happens to a nation when the institutional leadership of God's people becomes utterly, irreparably corrupt?
The author uses a brilliant literary device here called an inclusio, which is basically a set of thematic bookends using the motif of blindness.
Right, blindness.
We are told in chapter 3 that Eli's eyes had begun to grow dim so that he could not see. Yes, he is physically elderly, but in Hebrew narrative, physical ailments often mirror spiritual realities.
So he's spiritually blind.
Exactly. Eli is deeply spiritually blind. He knows what his sons are doing, but he refuses to actually discipline them or remove them from office. He honors his corrupt sons above the holiness of Yahweh.
And that physical and spiritual blindness sets a dark, ominous tone that is going to shadow the entire narrative. In fact, our sources note that this blindness bookend will be perfectly mirrored at the very end of the book by King Saul, who also descends into a terrifying spiritual darkness.
Parallels are definitely intentional.
So the priesthood is thoroughly corrupt, the nation is spiritually blind, the Philistines are pressing in, the powder keg is full, and somebody is about to light a match.
And it doesn't take long.
Right. The Israelites realize they are in trouble. They can't just keep getting pushed around by the Philistines. The tension boils over, taking us to the next major movement in the text, chronologically around 1075 BC. The Israelites gather their tribal militia and go out to fight the Philistines at the Battle of Aphek.
And it does not go well.
They get completely routed. The text says they lose 4,000 men on the battlefield. The elders of Israel retreat to their camp, look at the carnage, and they try to figure out what went wrong. And they have what they think is a brilliant theological idea.
Which is usually a bad sign in this book.
Yeah, they say, let's go to Shiloh, grab the Ark of the Covenant, and bring it down to the war zone. It will save us from the hand of our enemies.
It is a devastating miscalculation.
Yeah.
They are treating the Ark of the Covenant, which is the footstool of Yahweh's presence on earth, the most sacred object in their religion, like a magical talisman.
Like a lucky rabbit's foot. Or a weapon they can just point at the bad guys.
Exactly. They believe they can manipulate God into fighting for them simply by dragging his furniture into the battle.
His furniture, wow.
Yeah, they assume that God is tied to the physical box and that he is obligated to defend it and, by extension, defend them regardless of their rampant, unrepentant sin. It's the ultimate presumption. But God refuses to be manipulated or weaponized by a corrupt people.
The result of this presumption is absolute catastrophe. The Philistines attack again, and Israel loses 30,000 foot soldiers. It's a massacre.
30,000. It's staggering.
And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who accompanied the ark, are killed in a single day, which fulfills a prior prophecy of judgment against Eli's house. And then the unthinkable happens, the nightmare scenario. The Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant and carry it away as a spoil of war.
The worst possible outcome.
When a messenger runs back to Shiloh and tells the blind priest Eli the news, the shock is so severe that Eli falls backward off his chair, breaks his neck, and dies. Simultaneously, his pregnant daughter-in-law goes into premature labor, gives birth, and with her dying breath names the child Ichabod.
Meaning the glory has departed.
Up to this point, it is the darkest moment in the history of the Israelite nation. The priesthood is dead, the army is destroyed, and God, seemingly, has been kidnapped.
It looks like total defeat.
This is where I want to pause and look at this through the lens of ancient Near Eastern psychology, because modern readers might think, oh no, they lost the sacred artifact. But in the ancient world, warfare was inherently theological.
Absolutely. The spiritual and the physical were deeply intertwined.
If my nation goes to war with your nation, and my army captures your god's idol or your sacred ark, the conclusion is obvious. My god is stronger than your god. My god just beat up your god and took him prisoner. It's like capturing the enemy's flag, but with massive cosmic implications.
Right.
So from the Philistines' perspective, didn't they think they had Yahweh in a cage? Didn't they assume their chief deity, Dagon, was the supreme ruler of the cosmos?
That was the universal assumption of ancient Near Eastern military theology. The victor's god is supreme, the loser's god is weak. And the sources point out how enthusiastically the biblical text subverts and mocks this pagan myth in chapter 5.
Oh, this part is amazing.
It really is. The Philistines take their ultimate trophy, the Ark of Yahweh, and they transport it to Ashdod, one of their capital cities. They bring it into the central temple of their chief god, Dagon, and they place it right beside Dagon's statue.
Making a statement.
The symbolism is clear, yeah. Yahweh is being placed at the feet of Dagon as a subservient, defeated captive.
But Yahweh doesn't play by ancient Near Eastern rules.
Yep. He certainly does not. Yahweh allows himself to be taken into exile, entering the pagan temple, not as a captive, but as a conqueror behind enemy lines.
The narrative here is filled with this incredible dark humor and theological irony.
So much irony.
The Philistine priests wake up the next morning, walk into the temple, and they find the massive statue of Dagon fallen flat on its face on the ground right in front of the Ark of the Lord. It looks exactly like Dagon is bowing down in worship to Yahweh.
You can imagine the panic.
Oh, absolutely. So they panic, they pick their heavy idol back up and put him in his place. You can almost hear them rationalizing it. Oops, clumsy idol. Must have been a minor earthquake. Let's just prop him up.
And you have to understand who Dagon was to them. In the ancient Canaanite and Philistine pantheons, Dagon was a major agricultural deity. He was the god of grain, storm, and fertility. The Philistines attributed their prosperity and their Iron Age success to his blessing.
He was their heavy hitter?
Right. So the next morning, they enter the temple again. Dagon is on the ground again. But this time, his head and both his hands are broken off, lying severed upon the temple threshold. Only his torso is intact.
It's an execution.
It is a ritual decapitation and dismemberment. In the ancient world, cutting off the head and hands of a defeated enemy king was the ultimate unmistakable sign of military victory and total subjugation.
Wow.
Without a single Israelite soldier present, without a single sword swung by a human hand, Yahweh has completely dismantled the head of the Philistine pantheon in his own stronghold.
And it escalates rapidly from there. The text says the hand of the Lord is heavy against the people of Ashdod. They are struck with a severe plague, tumors, or boils. They realize the connection, so the lords of Ashdod panic and say, get this thing out of our city.
They're terrified.
They ship the ark to the city of Gath. The plagues hit Gath. A great panic ensues, so they ship it to Ekron. The people of Ekron see it coming and literally cry out, they have brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us and our people.
It's like hot potato.
Yeah, the entire Philistine Pentapolis goes into total economic and public health meltdown. They thought they captured a defeated deity, but they actually brought a consuming, uncontrollable fire into their living room.
The pastoral and theological application our sources draw from this is profound. The author is demonstrating Yahweh's absolute, unassailable sovereignty.
Even when his people fail.
Exactly. When the Israelite army completely fails, when the human priesthood is corrupt to the core, when the glory seems to have departed the land entirely, Yahweh does not need a human institution to defend his holiness. He is perfectly capable of defending his own glory.
He turns the Philistines' theological assumptions completely upside down.
Terrifying them to the point that they willingly send the ark back to Israel on a new cart pulled by 2 milk cows, packing it with a guilt offering of gold just to appease him. It is a stunning, brilliant polemic against pagan idolatry.
Okay, so the ark eventually makes its way back to Israelite territory. The prophet Samuel steps up. He calls the nation to repentance at a place called Mizpah. God gives them a miraculous victory, and there is a temporary era of peace under Samuel's leadership as a judge.
Things are looking up for a moment.
But time passes. Samuel grows old. He appoints his sons to be judges in his place, and, well, history tragically repeats itself.
It always does.
His sons turn out to be corrupt. They take bribes and pervert justice. The people realize the current system is broken, but instead of seeking God for a solution, they look around at their neighbors and decide they need a warlord. They need a king.
This is a massive turning point.
This brings us to chapter 8, roughly 1050 BC. The elders of Israel gather together, come to Samuel at Ramah, and say, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations.
Like all the nations, that phrase is the pivot point of the entire narrative.
Wait, hold on. I'm looking at this and thinking, I'm a bit confused. I thought earlier in the Torah, I think it's in Deuteronomy, God actually told them they would have a king one day.
He did, yes.
Moses literally says in Deuteronomy 17, when you come to the land and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose.
Yep, it's right there in the text.
So why is God suddenly so profoundly offended by this request in 1 Samuel 8? Samuel is personally insulted, and God says to Samuel, they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Why they anger if it was already permitted?
That is a critical tension to resolve, and the conservative framework provides a really elegant intertextual nuance here. The son of the Israelites in 1 Samuel 8 was not the request for a king in itself.
Because the monarchy was always in God's long-term plan?
Right. The sin was the motive behind the request and the type of king they were demanding.
Ah, okay, the motive.
The mandate in Deuteronomy 17 envisioned a very specific kind of king. He was to be covenant keeper. He was strictly forbidden from acquiring excessive wealth, multiple wives, or a massive standing army of horses from Egypt.
Very different from the kings around them.
Exactly. He was required to write his own copy of the Torah, read it daily, and lead the nation in humble submission to Yahweh as the ultimate suzerain or high king.
He was supposed to be a king under the king, a representative, not a replacement.
Precisely. But look at what the elders in 1 Samuel 8 are actually asking for. They aren't asking for a Deuteronomic, Torah-reading king. They are looking across the border at the Philistines with their iron chariots, their centralized military command, and their towering warlords, and the Israelites are terrified.
They want what the Philistines have.
They want a secular, human-centric military savior. They explicitly say, we want a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.
So they're outsourcing their faith.
They are fundamentally rejecting the covenantal relationship where Yahweh fights for them through their faith and repentance in exchange for raw, secular political pragmatism.
They want a standing army and a tall guy with a big sword. It's easier to put your faith in armor than it is to put your faith in an invisible God who demands moral purity.
That's human nature.
And the sources reveal an absolutely brilliant phonetic pun hidden in the Hebrew text regarding this entire sequence. It revolves around the Hebrew root word el, which means to ask or to demand.
The Hebrew wordplay here is staggering. Let's trace it. Go back to chapter 1. Hannah prays for a son. When she gets him, she names him Samuel.
Right.
The text explicitly links this to the root el, with Hannah saying, because I have asked him of the Lord.
Yeah.
So Samuel's the one requested in faithful, humble prayer.
That makes sense.
Now jump to chapter 8. The elders come to Samuel, and they use that exact same Hebrew root to demand or ask for a king. Yeah. And what is God's response?
He gives them exactly what they asked for.
He gives them exactly what they relentlessly ask for. He gives them a man named Saul. And Saul's Hebrew name, Shul, literally translates to the asked for one.
Wow. It is the ultimate careful what you wish for literary joke. You demanded a king like the pagan nations. You rejected me. Fine. Here is the literal embodiment of your fleshly, worldly request. Here is Jul, the asked for one.
And if we look at Saul's character and how the narrative introduces him, the irony only deepens. When Saul walks onto the page in chapter 9, the text goes out of its way to emphasize his physical appearance.
Right, it focuses on how he looks.
It says he was a handsome young man, and from his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. He looks exactly like what a terrified, secularizing nation thinks a king should look like.
He is central casting for an ancient Near Eastern warlord.
He's the guy you put on the campaign poster?
But the narrative irony is that his towering outward stature completely masks a deeply rooted inward cowardice and insecurity. When it comes time for his public coronation at Mizpah, Samuel calls the tribes together, they cast lots, Saul is chosen, and, well, they can't find him.
He's missing.
Where is this majestic, towering savior of the nation? He is literally hiding out among the baggage train. I always compare it to a newly elected CEO of a massive Fortune 500 company hiding in the supply closet on his first day because he's terrified of the board meeting.
It's pathetic, really.
And later in the story, when confronted by a true giant, Goliath, where is Saul? He is sitting in his royal tent, paralyzed by fear, shrinking back from the very job the people hired him to do.
Which brings us to the tragic downfall of Saul's reign, detailed in chapters 13 and 15. The sources highlight two fatal acts of disobedience that seal his rejection by God.
Let's walk through those.
Let's look at the first one in chapter 13. Saul is facing a massive Philistine invasion force at a place called Michmash. Samuel has told Saul to go to Gilgal and wait exactly 7 days. Samuel will arrive, offer the necessary sacrifices to secure God's favor, and then they will go to war.
Seems like simple instructions.
But the situation deteriorates. The Philistines are gathering. The Israelite soldiers are terrified, deserting the army and hiding in caves. And Samuel is late.
The pressure is mounting.
Day 7 arrives, and Samuel isn't there. So Saul, acting out of sheer pragmatism and panic, usurps the priestly role. He takes the burnt offering and sacrifices it himself.
And of course, the very moment he finishes the unauthorized ritual, Samuel walks into camp. Saul immediately tries to justify it. He says, I saw the people scattering. I said, now the Philistines will come down against me, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering.
I forced myself. Notice how he viewed the sacrifice.
Yeah, like a magic spell. A mechanistic ritual required to unlock God's military power.
But Samuel's response is devastating. He says, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord. Now your kingdom shall not continue.
Before we get to his second failure, I want to pause on a detail in chapter 13 that our sources highlight, because it paints a vivid picture of why Saul and his men were so terrified. It has to do with that Philistine iron monopoly we mentioned earlier.
Yes, the text gives us a remarkable historical footnote here. It states that there was no blacksmith to be found in all the land of Israel. The Philistines had instituted a strict embargo, reasoning lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears.
That's a brutal economic strategy.
If an Israelite farmer wanted to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle, he had to go down into Philistine territory and pay an exorbitant fee, 2/3 of a shekel, just to get his farm tools sharpened.
Think about the psychological and economic subjugation of that. How do you even run a basic agrarian society?
It's nearly impossible.
Imagine an Israelite farmer trying to harvest his wheat. His bronze sickle gets dull. He can't just fix it. He has to pack up, walk a day's journey into enemy territory, hand over a massive chunk of his hard-earned grain to a Philistine blacksmith, and wait while the smith sharpens his tool.
Knowing full well what that blacksmith is really doing.
Right. All the while, that farmer knows that the forge next to him is actively churning out iron swords that will eventually be used to kill his neighbors. And then, on the day of battle at Michmash, the text says that neither sword nor spear was found in the hand of any of the Israelite soldiers, except for Saul and his son Jonathan.
They are an army of farmers holding dull farm equipment against the ancient equivalent of tanks.
It perfectly illustrates the desperation.
But God's point is that he doesn't need iron swords to win a battle. He needs faithful obedience. And Saul failed that test.
He failed miserably.
That fatal flaw valuing pragmatism over obedience is repeated and amplified in chapter 15. God commands Saul to execute the harem, which is the ban or total destruction against a nation called the Amalekites.
Who are the Amalekites exactly?
The Amalekites were a nomadic raiding group that had historically preyed on the weakest Israelites in the desert during the Exodus. God commands Saul to act as an instrument of divine judgment and spare nothing.
This concept of herm warfare is difficult for modern readers, but in the ancient context, it meant devoting the entire conquered city to God through destruction, ensuring nobody profited from the war.
Right, it wasn't about plunder. But Saul goes to war, defeats the Amalekites, and then his pragmatism kicks in again. He looks at the massive flocks of sheep and oxen, and he looks at King Agag. And he decides to keep the best of the livestock, and he takes the enemy king alive as a trophy.
Unbelievable.
When Samuel comes to confront him, Saul boldly lies. He walks up and says, "Blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord."
And Samuel asks that famous piercing question, what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear?
Caught red-handed.
Yeah. Saul immediately backpedals and blames the people. He claims the soldiers kept the best animals not out of greed, but to sacrifice them to Yahweh at Gilgal. He tries to dress up his blatant disobedience in the language of extreme religious piety.
It's spiritual manipulation. And this leads to what the sources consider the core theological theme of the entire book, delivered in Samuel's devastating rebuke in 15.22.
What does Samuel say?
Samuel says, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams."
That is so powerful.
He equates Saul's rebellious pragmatism with the sin of witchcraft and idolatry. Because Saul rejected the word of the Lord, God rejects him from being king.
It is a terrifying pastoral application for the modern reader. God demands the whole heart, not just outward religious performance. We cannot cover our deliberate pragmatic disobedience with a thin veneer of worship.
That marks the definitive end of Saul's dynasty. The Spirit of the Lord departs from him, an evil spirit torments him, and he begins a long, agonizing descent into paranoia and spiritual darkness.
Now, for the history nerds out there, I want to briefly touch on a classic scholarly debate our sources cover regarding Saul's reign. How long did Saul actually rule?
This is a famous textual issue.
Yeah, if you look at the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text in 1 Samuel 13.1, it is notoriously corrupted. It literally translates to something like, Saul was a year old when he began to reign, and he reigned 2 years over Israel, which obviously makes zero historical sense.
Right. This is a common issue in textual criticism. Numbers in ancient Hebrew manuscripts were sometimes represented by symbols or letters that were easily smudged or miscopied by scribes over centuries.
So how do scholars handle that?
More skeptical scholars often use this missing data to suggest the entire text is unreliable myth. However, the scholars in our source material synthesize a solution by looking at the broader biblical canon and external evidence.
Looking elsewhere in the Bible, basically.
Yes. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who was a Pharisee deeply trained in Jewish history, states in Acts 13.21 that God gave them Saul for 40 years.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Furthermore, when historians synchronize this 40-year window with the archaeological strata of early Iron Age military forts in the Levant, it fits perfectly into the timeline of Israel transitioning from a loose tribal defense to a centralized state bureaucracy.
Which sets the stage for God's sovereign, historically grounded solution. If the fleshly, pragmatic King Saul is rejected, who will take his place? We are roughly at 125 BC.
Enter David.
Right. God tells Samuel to stop mourning over Saul. He sends the prophet down to the little town of Bethlehem, to the house of a man named Jesse, to secretly anoint a new king. And here we see the ultimate contrast, the reversal of fortune enacted perfectly.
The theme from Hannah's song returns.
Jesse parades his oldest, tallest, most impressive sons before Samuel. When Samuel sees Eliab, the firstborn, he looks at him and thinks, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Eliab is tall, handsome, muscular. He looks exactly like Saul.
Samuel is still falling into the same trap, but Yahweh corrects him immediately. God says to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart."
The youngest son, David, isn't even considered important enough to invite to the sacrifice. He is out in the fields doing the dirty, dangerous work of keeping the sheep, but he is the one God chooses. He is anointed, and the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him from that day forward.
But right here, we run into a classic, critical, scholarly debate found in the sources.
Yes, I want to see how the conservative framework handles this apparent contradiction. In chapter 16, David is introduced to Saul's court as a highly skilled musician and a man of valor. Saul's servants recruit David to play the lyre to soothe Saul's tormenting spirit. Saul loves David and promotes him to be his armor-bearer.
That's chapter 16.
But then you turn the page to chapter 17, the famous story of Goliath. And suddenly, David is introduced as an unknown shepherd boy who is just running errands, bringing cheese and bread to his brothers on the battlefield.
It seems like a continuity error.
When David volunteers to fight the giant, Saul asks his top commander, Abner, whose son is this youth? Abner has no idea. Saul doesn't seem to recognize his own armor-bearer. For listeners not steeped in biblical academia, there's a group called the critical documentarians. Who are they, and what is their theory here?
The documentarian hypothesis is a critical academic theory suggesting that the biblical texts are a patchwork of different, often contradictory source documents compiled much later.
So they just mash them together.
That's the theory. When documentarians read chapters 16 and 17, they argue that a clumsy editor mashed two incompatible traditions together, a court history of David, where he is a royal musician, and a separate shepherd boy myth, where he fights a giant without bothering to smooth out the timeline.
Okay, so how do the conservative scholars in our notes defend the text? How do they resolve that tension?
They argue that this is not a chronological error at all. Rather, it is a sophisticated literary technique common in Hebrew narrative pacing.
Narrative pacing, okay.
Ancient Hebrew storytelling often prioritized thematic grouping over strict linear chronology. Chapter 16 is designed to establish David's spiritual credentials first. It shows the reader the underlying theological reality. The Spirit has left Saul and entered David.
Setting the theological baseline.
Exactly. It shows how David gained providential, private access to the inner workings of the royal court. Having established that theological baseline for the reader, chapter 17 then flashes back or shifts perspective to provide David's public military verification.
And what about Saul not recognizing him?
From the perspective of Saul as a king in chapter 17, when he asks, "Whose son is this?" he isn't necessarily saying he's never seen the boy before. David has just promised to kill the giant, and Saul has promised to exempt the victor's father's house from taxes and give the victor his daughter in marriage.
Oh, so it's a legal question.
Yes. Saul needs to know the exact legal lineage and family standing of the kid he's about to promote to royal status.
That makes a lot of sense when you realize ancient Near Eastern literature wasn't written to read like a modern Wikipedia timeline. Speaking of chapter 17, let's dive into the David and Goliath narrative. We all know the flannel graph Sunday school version, but our sources urge us to look deeper at the mechanics of the ancient world and the Christological focus of the event.
There's so much more going on here.
First, the mechanics. Why are they fighting this way?
Historically, this is a classic example of champion warfare. Instead of sending two massive armies to slaughter each other and lose thousands of men, the two sides agree to let their best single warrior fight to the death as proxies.
A trial by combat.
Exactly. It was viewed as a proxy battle of the gods. Goliath is a horrifying, towering instrument of Philistine Iron Age dominance. He is covered head to toe in scale armor.
But theologically, our sources trace this conflict all the way back to Genesis.
Yes, the concept of the Zerah, the promised seed. All the way back in Genesis 3.1f, God promised that the seed of the woman would ultimately crush the head of the serpent. Then in Genesis 49, Jacob prophesied that the royal scepter would not depart from the tribe of Judah.
And David is from the tribe of Judah.
Right. When he stands before Saul and explains why he, a teenager, can fight this terrifying giant, he doesn't brag about his sword skills. He says, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth."
He identifies himself as the good shepherd.
David identifies himself as the good shepherd who risks his life to protect his flock.
And the notes point out that this is a direct typological shadow pointing to Jesus Christ. Let's explain that term for a moment for you listening. A typological shadow means a historical person or event in the Old Testament that acts as a preview or a rough sketch of a greater reality that will be fulfilled in Christ.
A very helpful concept.
Jesus explicitly says in the Gospel of John, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." David killing the lion and the bear to save his sheep is a historical, physical preview of Christ defeating sin, death, and Satan to save his people.
And notice how David fights. When he goes out to meet Goliath, he refuses to wear Saul's heavy, restrictive bronze armor. He relies entirely on a shepherd's tools, 5 smooth stones and his sling.
And by the way, an ancient sling was not a child's toy.
Definitely not a toy. It was a deadly weapon that could hurl a stone at the speed of an early handgun bullet.
But his primary motivation is theological. He yells to the Philistines, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied."
He knows who is really fighting.
David deeply understands the covenant. He knows that Yahweh is the true king who fights for Israel, and with one stone, he sinks it into the giant's forehead, crushing the head of the serpent's champion.
It's an incredible climax, the ultimate underdog victory. But interestingly, it doesn't lead to an immediate crown for David.
No. In fact, it leads to decades of intense suffering. As David becomes a national hero, the women sing, "Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Saul's paranoia reaches a fever pitch. Trace those ensuing wilderness years for us."
Saul becomes consumed by jealousy and demonic torment. He repeatedly tries to pin David to the wall with his spear. David is forced to flee the palace.
Leaving everything behind.
He leaves behind his wife, Michal, and his best friend, Jonathan. Ironically, Jonathan is Saul's son and the heir apparent, but Jonathan recognizes that David is the true chosen king and willingly cedes his right to the throne, forging a covenant with David.
David becomes a fugitive. He lives in caves in the desolate wilderness of En-Gedi, gathering a band of outlaws, jetters, and marginalized people around him. He is hunted like an animal by Saul and 3,000 elite Israelite troops.
It is a brutal, agonizing time. But the sources highlight that these dark wilderness years are exactly where David's theological integrity is forged.
How so?
Well, on 2 distinct occasions during this manhunt. Once in a cave in Engedi where Saul wanders in to relieve himself, and once in Saul's camp dead of night, David has the perfect, unimpeded opportunity to assassinate Saul and take the throne.
His own men are whispering in his ear, saying, God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Do it.
It is the ultimate test of character. Will David seize the throne through violence and pragmatism, just like Saul would, or will he wait for God?
And David absolutely refuses. He says, the Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed.
That phrase, the Lord's anointed, is actually the Hebrew word Messiah.
Wow.
David understands a profound theological reality. God placed Saul on the throne, and therefore only God has the right to remove him. David refuses to take the kingdom by the flesh. He values covenant faithfulness over personal advancement.
It is a staggering display of trusting God's timing, and it stands in absolute stark contrast to Saul's tragic, terrifying end. The book closes with chapters 28 through 31, roughly 1010 BC. The Philistines are gathering their combined forces for a massive, overwhelming invasion.
Things are falling apart.
Samuel has died, and God has gone completely silent toward Saul. No dreams, no prophetic visions, no answers from the Urim and Thummim. Total divine silence.
And this leads to Saul's apocalyptic decline. In sheer desperation, he completely violates his own previous laws. Earlier in his reign, Saul had correctly banished all the mediums and necromancers from the land.
Because that was forbidden by Torah.
Right. But now, cut off from God, he disguises himself in the dead of night and travels to Endor to consult a medium. He asks her to conduct a seance to bring up the spirit of the deceased prophet Samuel from the underworld.
It is one of the darkest, most pathetic scenes in the Bible. The king of Israel consulting a witch in the dark, and shockingly, God allows Samuel to appear, but only to deliver a final, crushing oracle of doom.
Samuel tells Saul, "The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me."
The judgment is finalized. The very next day, on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, the Israelite army is slaughtered. Jonathan, David's beloved friend, is killed in action. Saul is critically wounded by Philistine archers.
It's a total collapse.
Terrified of being captured and tortured by the uncircumcised Philistines, Saul begs his armor-bearer to kill him. When the armor-bearer refuses, Saul takes his own sword and falls on it.
It is a catastrophic, shameful end to the first human-centric king. And the sources point out that this completes the book's inclusio of spiritual blindness.
The book ends.
The book began with the physically and spiritually blind priest Eli falling backward and breaking his neck in the dark. It ends with the spiritually blind King Saul falling forward on his sword in the dark.
Wow. So 1 Samuel leaves us in a highly precarious place. The Philistines have won the battle, the king is dead, the bodies of the royal family are hung on a pagan wall, and the fugitive David is left to pick up the pieces, which he will eventually do in 2 Samuel.
Right, but this story obviously doesn't end there.
No, I want to naturally transition the narrative here, as our source material does. 1 Samuel leaves us with the promise of a successful David. And if you know the rest of the historical books, you know David does establish a massive empire. God makes a covenant with him in 2 Samuel 7, promising that a king from his line will sit on the throne forever.
The Davidic covenant.
But we also know the rest of the history. Human kingship, even the Davidic lineage, eventually fails. David's descendants become corrupt, the nation splits in half, they fall into idolatry, and eventually the capital city of Jerusalem is burned to the ground and the people are exiled to Babylon.
It all comes crashing down.
So if human kingship, even the best possible version of it, ultimately collapses under the weight of human sin, where does the source material look for ultimate hope?
To answer that, the expert notes guide the listener hundreds of years later, jumping to the 8th century BC and into the writings of the prophet Isaiah.
Let's talk about Isaiah.
Isaiah is operating during the slow decline of the Davidic monarchy. He is ministering to the southern kingdom of Judah, while the brutal Assyrian Empire threatens to annihilate them. Isaiah functions as a canonical bridge.
What do you mean by canonical bridge?
He receives the theology of the Davidic covenant that started in Samuel, but he transforms it. He elevates the promise of a king from a local geopolitical reality into a massive, cosmic, eschatological hope.
Let's explore that transformation. How does Isaiah frame this hope? Our sources focus heavily on Isaiah's inaugural vision in chapter 6. He is in the temple in the year that King Uzziah died, and he sees the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up.
That vision in chapter 6 establishes the foundational thematic pillar of the entire book of Isaiah, the absolute holiness of Yahweh.
Isaiah watches the angelic seraphim flying around the throne, crying out the trisagion, The threefold declaration, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory.
What's vital to understand here is what holiness actually means in this context. It isn't just about moral purity, though it certainly includes that. The sources explain that this is about God's radical alterity,
Take care.
his utter cosmic transcendence. He is wholly other. He is infinite. He is not like the corrupt, failing kings of Judah, and he's certainly not like the localized, manipulatable deities of the surrounding pagan nations.
He is the Holy One of Israel.
Yes, a title Isaiah uses constantly to remind the people of who they're dealing with. But this creates a massive theological tension.
Because the people are so sinful.
Right. If God is absolutely transcendently holy, a consuming fire, and the nation of Israel is pervasively sinful, rebellious, and failing to keep the covenant, how do they survive? How does the promise of David's eternal throne not just get completely incinerated by the consuming fire of God's justice?
That is the ultimate question of the Old Testament. If God must judge sin, how does the story not end in complete annihilation? The sources introduce a crucial Hebrew concept here that Isaiah develops beautifully. The concept of the shear, or the remnant.
That's the key. Because God is holy, he must execute justice and judge the corporate nation of Israel. They will face invasion. They will face the devastation of exile. But because God is also covenantally faithful to the promise he made to David, he cannot utterly destroy them.
So he saves a remnant.
Yes, salvation will be realized through a shear, a small purified core, a remnant that survives the crucible of divine judgment. This theme is so central to Isaiah's theology that he literally names his own son Shir Jashub, which translates to "a remnant shall return."
That's quite a name for a kid.
It's a living prophetic message. Think of God acting like a master pruner in an orchard. He cuts down the dead, diseased branches of the national tree, not to destroy the tree out of spite, but to preserve a faithful core from which new, vibrant life can spring.
And that leads perfectly to the conclusion of our source content, which focuses on Isaiah's breathtaking vision in chapter 11. Isaiah uses a powerful arboreal metaphor to describe this eschatological king, this ultimate Messiah. He says, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit."
The stump of Jesse. Think about the historical context we just walked through.
Yeah.
Jesse was David's father back in Bethlehem. By referring to the stump of Jesse, Isaiah is prophetically acknowledging that the glorious towering tree of the Davidic dynasty is going to be chopped down by judgment.
The monarchy is going to collapse.
The kings will be taken off the throne. To the naked eye of history, the lineage will look completely irreversibly dead, just like a stump left on the ground after a massive logging operation.
It's an incredible analogy. I always compare this to a forest fire. I've walked through forests the few weeks after a massive blaze has swept through. The ground is pure ash. The trees are just black, charred skeletons. Everything smells like smoke, and it looks utterly, hopelessly dead. You think life will never return to that mountain.
But if you look closely,
Right, if you get down on your hands and knees and look closely at the base of a charred stump, you will sometimes see a single, vibrant green shoot pushing its way up through the black ash. It's almost miraculous.
and that is exactly what Isaiah is prophesying. Out of the collapsed, seemingly dead lineage of David, out of the ashes of the Babylonian exile and the failure of human kingship, a single green shoot will emerge,
An eschatological king.
the ultimate Messiah.
And Isaiah says, "The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might. He will judge the poor with true righteousness, and he will slay the wicked with the breath of his lips."
He is the ultimate fulfillment of the promise given earlier in Isaiah 7 Emmanuel, which translates to God with us. Not just another human king trying his best and failing, but God himself taking on flesh to rule perfectly and righteously. And his reign won't just bring temporary political peace to the Middle East, it will bring cosmic shalom. Isaiah paints this breathtaking, surreal picture of the wolf dwelling with the lamb, the leopard lying down with the goat, and a nursing child playing safely over the hole of a cobra.
The curse of Genesis 3 is finally rolled back. Natural animosities are reconciled. The entire cosmos, humanity and nature alike, is brought into perfect, peaceful submission under the true and final king.
It's a beautiful, beautiful picture of hope.
Wow. From the quiet, desperate prayer of a barren woman in a dusty tabernacle in Shiloh to the cosmic recreation of the entire universe. What an incredible, sweeping journey we've been on today.
It's a lot to take in, but it's so rich.
To summarize this deep dive for you, the listener, we started in the dark ages of Israel, witnessing Hannah's faithful prayer that introduced the foundational theme of the reversal of fortune. We saw the profound folly of the Israelites trying to use the Ark of the Covenant as a magic trick, and Yahweh proving he defends his own glory by decapitating Dagon.
And then the rise of the kings.
We watched the tragic, ironic reign of Saul, the asked-for king, who looked the part but lacked the heart, proving that to obey is better than sacrifice. We trace the rise of the shepherd King David, the giant slayer who refused to grasp power but waited patiently for God's timing.
And finally, we looked ahead with Isaiah.
Right, to the ultimate hope, that even when our human institutions completely fail and are chopped down to a stump, God preserves a remnant and promises a flawless, eternal king.
And we always want to end with a takeaway, the so what, for your own life. Why does this ancient history, these survey notes, matter to you today?
Yeah, how does this apply now?
This entire epic forces us to hold up a mirror. Are we, like the elders in 1 Samuel 8, constantly demanding our own earthly kings, political saviors, dynamic cultural influencers, pragmatic silver bullet solutions to solve our deepest spiritual problems?
That's a convicting question.
Are we judging our leaders and judging ourselves by outward appearance and towering stature, just like the nation did with Saul? Or are we cultivating the inner heart of a David, valuing quiet obedience, trusting in God's timing even when we are in the wilderness, and relying on the Lord of hosts rather than strapping on the heavy, pragmatic armor of the flesh?
It's a profound challenge. We tend to want the iron chariots and the tall kings, but God wants the broken and contrite heart. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own regarding this concept of the remnant, the shear.
A very relevant concept today.
Think about your own life, your community, your workplace, or even modern history. We live in a world that is absolutely obsessed with scale. We obsess over the loud majority, the massive crowds, institutional power, and trending movements.
We measure success by size.
But if we learn anything from the books of Samuel and the prophet Isaiah, it's that true renewal, ultimate survival, and profound societal change almost never come from the top down. They don't come from the giant statues or the towering kings.
They usually emerge from the remnant.
Exactly. A small, faithful, purified core that survives the crucible of cultural exile and judgment. So look around. Where is the remnant in your world right now? And what tiny green shoots might be growing from the stumps you thought were completely dead?